The day her marriage ended, Dana Calloway stood in a parking lot outside the Hargrove County Courthouse and held her whole life in a single brown paper bag. Inside it were the things she had grabbed from the kitchen counter before the moving company her husband hired arrived and cleared out everything else. A spatula with a melted handle. Her mother's old recipe card for cornbread. A photograph of her daughter Maya taken at the beach 4 summers ago, when things were still good, or at least when things still looked good from the outside. A tube of hand lotion she had been meaning to finish. And a key on a simple metal ring, engraved with the letters GC, that the lawyer had handed her that morning across the conference table, while Brandon sat 3 seats away with that expression she now recognized as triumph dressed up as regret. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Brandon Calloway had been saying variations of the same thing for the better part of 11 months. First quietly, in the kitchen over cold coffee. Then louder, in the driveway in front of their neighbors. Then through his attorney, a man named Gerald Pierce who billed $420 an hour and wore shoes that cost more than Dana's car payment. The phrase was always the same. You'll get nothing in the divorce. He said it the first time in February, when she told him she knew about the other woman. He said it like it was a business forecast, calm and certain, the way men say things when they have already decided the outcome in advance. He said it again in March when she moved into her sister's spare bedroom with Maya and 2 suitcases. He said it through Pierce in April, May, June, and July, each time attached to some new legal maneuver designed to drain what little fight she had left in her. Brandon was not wrong about the numbers. They had been married for 9 years. The house was in his name, purchased before the wedding with money from his family. The savings account had been quietly emptied over 18 months into an LLC his cousin controlled. The car she drove was a lease in his name. Her income as a dental hygienist covered Maya's school supplies and her sister's utility bills, and very little else. What Brandon did not know, because Dana herself barely knew it until that morning in the lawyer's office, was that her grandfather had died in March and left her something in his will. The attorney who handled Elias Greer's estate was a small man named Bill Kaufman who worked out of a converted Victorian house on the edge of town and drove a truck with a gun rack and a bumper sticker that said retired but not dead. He had called Dana twice, and both times she had been in the middle of something that felt more urgent. Moving boxes. Maya's asthma prescription. A custody hearing that left her so hollowed out she sat in the courthouse bathroom for 20 minutes before she could make her legs work properly again. She finally saw Kaufman on the same morning she signed the last of the divorce papers. He sat across from her in a side office that smelled like old paper and WD-40, and he slid a single sheet across the desk and said, "Your grandfather left you his property on Grayling Creek. The cabin and the land around it. About 7 acres, give or take." Dana had not thought about that cabin in years. She remembered it from childhood mostly as a smell, pine resin and fish, and the particular mustiness of a place that held moisture in its walls through every season. She remembered the creek itself better than the structure, the way it moved in summer, slow and dark green, and cold no matter how hot the air above it got. She remembered sitting on the bank with Elias while he explained things she was too young to understand about the way water moved over rock, about patience and reading the current, and how the best fishing spots were always the ones nobody else thought to look at. She had not been back since she was maybe 14 years old. The cabin had been a place her grandfather disappeared to. A place the rest of the family talked about with a kind of affectionate dismissal. That old shack of Elias's. That fishing hole he loved so much. What's he going to do? Live out there forever? He had, more or less, until the end. Kaufman handed her the key ring, told her the property taxes were paid through the end of the year, and said there was no mortgage. It was hers free and clear. She stood in the parking lot afterward with the paper bag in her arms and the key in her hand and thought, 7 acres. A cabin, no mortgage, and tried to feel something other than exhausted. The drive to Grayling Creek took 40 minutes on the highway and another 20 on roads that got progressively smaller until they were barely 2 tire tracks through grass and gravel. Dana drove it alone on a Saturday in late September with Maya in the back seat doing homework on a paper clipboard because the signal out here was non-existent and the tablet was useless. Maya was 10. She had Dana's dark hair and her father's certainty, which was a combination that could be either wonderful or exhausting, depending on the day. She had handled the divorce the way children sometimes handle catastrophic things, by going very quiet at home and very loud at school. Until her teacher called and Dana had a conversation, she still thought about it 2 in the morning when her brain refused to let her sleep. When the cabin came into view through the trees, Maya pressed her face against the window glass and said, "Is that it?" Dana stopped the car at the edge of the clearing and looked at what her grandfather had left her. The cabin was small. That was the first true thing she could say about it. Maybe 400 square feet if you were generous with the measurement. It sat on a slight rise above the creek, which she could hear before she could see it, the sound of moving water threading through the pine and birch that surrounded the property. The structure itself was board and batten wood, gray-brown with age, the roof covered in dark green standing seam metal that had rusted at the seams. The porch ran the full width of the front and sagged on the right side where one of the support posts had rotted near the base. 2 small windows faced the creek. The door was solid wood, old growth, heavier than it had any right to be when Dana finally pushed it open. Inside, the smell came back to her all at once. Pine and moisture and time. The space was one room, essentially. A wood stove in the corner. A built-in bunk against one wall. A small kitchen with a hand pump that connected to a shallow well. No bathroom that she could immediately find, which explained the small outbuilding she had noticed behind the cabin. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling on a wire, connected to a small solar panel mounted on the roof's southern face, which Elias must have added at some point in the last decade. A shelf ran the length of the wall above the bunk. It held fishing gear, tackle boxes, a few tools, and a row of composition notebooks with the dates written on their spines in black marker. The earliest one read 1987. The most recent read this past year, the same year her grandfather died. Maya had followed her inside and was turning in a slow circle. "It smells like a museum," she said. "It smells like your great-grandfather." Maya considered this and then nodded, because she had met Elias a handful of times and the description was accurate. She walked to the shelf and touched the spines of the notebooks with one finger, reading the dates. "He kept a diary? Looks like it. Can we read them?" Dana looked at the notebooks and thought about the fact that she had nowhere else to go. Her sister's spare bedroom had seemed like a short-term solution in February, and now it was October, and short-term had become something else entirely, something with no clear ending she could see. She was paying her sister $400 a month for a room that Maya slept in while Dana used a fold-out cot in the laundry room. She had been applying for apartments. 3 of them had rejected her because her credit score, dragged down by 9 years of joint finances with Brandon, did not meet their minimums. One had accepted her but required first, last, and security at once, which was $7,000 she did not have. She had 7 acres and a sagging cabin with no bathroom and a composting toilet situation she was already dreading. She said, "Maybe." They drove back to her sister's that evening, but Dana left the key on the chain around her neck. Over the following 2 weeks, she did what she always did when a problem seemed too large and too shapeless to confront directly. She made a list. She researched. She wrote things down in the same composition notebook she used for Maya's medical information and her own budget calculations, filling pages with questions and estimates and things she needed to know. The county property assessor's office had the cabin listed at $31,000. That was its assessed value for tax purposes, which she knew from experience was usually somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of actual market value. So somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000 to $60,000, maybe. If you could find someone willing to buy a 400-square-foot cabin on a dirt road with no indoor plumbing and a creek that flooded its banks twice a decade. She called a real estate agent in the area named Patrice Hollowell, who drove out to look at the property and then sat across from Dana in the front seat of her SUV with the particular expression of someone delivering bad news to a person who cannot afford it. "I can list it," Patrice said, "but I want to be honest with you. Properties like this, remote, rustic, functional issues, they sit. Could be 6 months. Could be more. And you'll have buyers coming in low because of the work it needs. The roof looks okay, but that porch needs to go down to the foundation before anyone can safely use it. The well should be tested. The outbuilding is falling in on the east side. What do you think it would sell for?" Patrice looked out the windshield at the cabin. "Honestly, 45 if we're lucky. Possibly less if the well water tests poor. $45,000. which sounded like a lot until Dana did the math. After Patrice's commission, closing costs, any repairs needed to make it show, and the 6 to 12 months of property taxes and maintenance while it sat on the market, she might clear $35,000, which was 1 year of her current income and not enough to buy anything equivalent or start the kind of life she was trying to imagine for herself and Maya. She thanked Patrice and told her she would think about it. She did not immediately call her back. Instead, on the first Saturday of October, she drove out to the cabin alone while Maya stayed with her sister. She sat on the porch steps, the ones that were still solid, and listened to the creak and thought about her grandfather. Elias Greer had been a quiet man, not remote, not cold, but economical in the way some people from his generation were, as though words were a resource you did not waste. He had been a machinist for 31 years at a plant that made industrial equipment, and he had the hands to show for it, thick-knuckled, permanently stained at the creases despite whatever soap he used. He had retired at 62 and spent the following 24 years doing the thing he had apparently always wanted to do, which was fish and think and be left largely alone. His wife, Dana's grandmother Ruth, had died when Dana was 3. He had never remarried. He had a daughter, Dana's mother, who called him every Sunday and visited twice a year and accepted his way of living without ever quite understanding it. He had a grandson, Dana's brother Keith, who had borrowed money from him twice and paid it back once. And he had Dana, who had sat with him on the bank of this creek at age 11 and learned to read water. She had not visited enough. That was the thing she kept circling back to, sitting on those porch steps. She had been busy. Then she had been married. Then she had been surviving. She had sent cards at Christmas and called on his birthday and told herself there would be time. There had not been time. She went inside and took the first of the composition notebooks down from the shelf. 1987. Elias would have been 53. The handwriting was precise, organized, the way he did everything. She sat on the bunk and read. The notebooks were not what she expected. She had imagined fishing logs, catch records, the kinds of notes a man might keep to track patterns and improve his success. There was some of that. But there was also something else, threaded through the practical entries like a second current beneath the main channel. He wrote about the land. Not the cabin specifically, not the fishing, but the property itself. The 7 acres. The creek. The specific way the light fell through the birches in the late afternoon. He wrote about finding arrowheads in the soil along the eastern bank, about the way certain plants indicated where water ran underground, about a section of higher ground at the back of the property where the soil was different, darker, and richer, running counter to everything around it. He wrote, in the notebook from 1991, about a man who had stopped at the end of the drive in a truck with a company logo on the door and asked if the land was for sale. Elias had said no. The man had come back 2 weeks later with a business card and a number, and Elias had said no again. He wrote about it without drama, just recorded it the way he recorded everything else. The beavers had dammed the lower tributary again. Caught 3 browns and a rainbow. Man from Telluride Resources came back. Said no. Water temperature dropping. May need to move the fall fishing to the morning hours. Telluride Resources. Dana wrote the name in her composition notebook. She found it again in the 1994 entries, and again in 2001, and once more in 2008. Each time, someone connected to that company or a successor company had contacted Elias about the land. Each time, he had said no. The offers increased. In 2008, someone offered him $220,000 for the 7 acres, which would have been an extraordinary amount for rural land in that county at that time. He had said no and then written underneath it, in his usual spare way, they want the back section. The creek doesn't matter to them. It's the ground above the eastern line. She put the notebook down and looked at the shelf. There were 26 more. She drove home that evening and did not sleep much. She lay on her fold-out cot in the laundry room with the smell of dryer sheets in the air and thought about a company that had spent nearly 2 decades trying to buy 7 acres from a retired machinist who fished for trout. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The thing about starting over at 38 is that nobody tells you how much of it happens in parking lots and waiting rooms. Dana sat in the parking lot of the county records office on a Tuesday morning and gave herself 5 minutes before she went inside. She had taken a half-day of vacation from the dental practice. Her supervisor, a woman named Carol who had been divorced twice herself, had asked no questions and simply moved Dana's afternoon appointments. The county records office was housed in a building that looked like it had been added onto 3 separate times by 3 separate architects who had never spoken to one another. The woman behind the counter had a name tag that said Dorothea and the expression of someone who had been answering questions from people who did not know what they were looking for since approximately 1994. Dana explained what she was looking for. Land records for the Greer property on Grayling Creek Road. Any permits filed, any easements recorded, any applications or surveys conducted in the last 40 years. Dorothea typed things into a computer that sounded like it was processing information through physical effort. Then she disappeared into a back room and returned with a manila folder roughly an inch thick. "You're not the first person to pull these," she said, which was not a question. "Who else has pulled them?" "Can't tell you that. But the file's been out twice in the last 18 months. She set it on the counter. "Take all the time you need. Can't make copies on the machine because it's broken. Can photograph with your phone." Dana spent 90 minutes at a table near the window working through the file. Most of it was standard. Property tax records going back to 1962, when Elias had purchased the land. A survey from 1978. A corrected survey from 1983. Deed of record. Several boundary agreements with neighboring properties. But near the back of the folder, she found something that did not fit the pattern of the rest. A permit application filed in 1989 by a company called Telluride Resources Incorporated. The application was for a geological survey of adjacent parcels in the Grayling Creek watershed. It had been approved. The survey had been conducted, and the results were part of the public record, filed as an attachment to the permit. She photographed every page. She sat in her car afterward and read through the survey on her phone screen, squinting at the technical language. She was not a geologist. She did not know what most of it meant. But she knew how to research, and she knew how to find people who knew things she did not. She called the geology department at the state university and left a message. She emailed a professor whose name she found through the university website after searching mineral surveys in Grayling County. She spent her lunch break reading every article she could find about Telluride Resources, which had changed its name twice since 1989 and was now part of a larger holding company called Meridian Extraction Group. The return call came 3 days later from a graduate student named Paul who worked in the geology department and had apparently been given her message by the professor. He had a young voice and the kind of barely contained excitement that people get when a question intersects perfectly with what they already know. "Yeah, so I looked at what you sent me," he said. "The 1989 survey. And I looked at the updated satellite geological data for that watershed, which is public through the USGS. Your 7 acres sit directly over what's called a mineralized contact zone, basically where 2 different rock formations meet underground. What does that mean practically? It means there are likely mineral deposits. The 1989 survey flagged copper and trace amounts of something else. They coded it as inconclusive back then because the extraction technology wasn't there yet to make it economically viable. And now, a pause. She could hear him scrolling through something. Now it might be a different conversation. There have been significant advances in extraction methods for low-grade deposits in the last 15 years. And copper prices are substantially higher than they were in 1989. I can't give you a valuation because I'm not a licensed appraiser, and this would need a full current survey to confirm. But he paused again. I'd say it's worth getting one. Dana sat in her car for a long time after she hung up. She thought about a man in a truck with a company logo, stopping at the end of a dirt drive in 1987, coming back 2 weeks later, coming back again in 1994, again in 2001, again in 2008, with an offer of $220,000 for 7 acres that were assessed at $31,000. They want the back section. The creek doesn't matter to them. She thought about Brandon standing at the kitchen counter in February, certain and calm, telling her she would get nothing. She thought about the key around her neck. She had not told anyone about the survey. Not her sister. Not her friend Jess, who called every Sunday and was the person Dana most wanted to call. Not her mother, who would have told her not to get her hopes up and then asked if she was eating properly. She needed to know what she actually had before she said anything to anyone. She needed facts, not possibilities. She had spent 9 years married to a man who dealt in certainties, who presented his assumptions as conclusions and his preferences as inevitable outcomes. She was not going to walk into any conversation about this without knowing exactly what she was talking about. She called the county assessor's office and asked about the process for requesting an updated property valuation based on new geological information. The man she spoke to said she would need a licensed mineral assessment from a certified appraiser, which was not the same as a standard property appraisal, and gave her a list of firms that conducted them in the state. The cheapest firm on the list charged $1,800. She looked at her bank account, which held $3,042, representing everything she had managed to accumulate since the separation after paying her sister's $400 a month in Maya's school expenses and her own basic costs. She called the firm. The woman who answered said they had an opening in 3 weeks. Dana said she would take it. She drove out to the cabin the following Saturday with Maya and spent the day doing what her grandfather had apparently done with most of his time there. She read the notebooks. She walked the property. She let Maya catch a small brown trout and then put it back, which was how Elias had apparently done things, always releasing what he caught. Maya had stopped mentioning her father's house in the way she had in the early months of the separation, the way that it felt like a needle. She had found her footing in her new school, made 2 friends she talked about constantly, and had decided that the cabin was, in her words, actually kind of cool once you got past the bathroom situation. They found the outbuilding behind the property together, pushing through overgrown grass to where the structure sat mostly hidden by 2 large spruce trees. It was larger than it looked from the cabin, roughly the same footprint as the main building, with walls of the same board and batten construction. The door was padlocked with a combination lock that had rusted shut. "What is this?" Maya pressed her eye to the gap between the doorboards. "It's dark in there. I can see something, though, like shelves." Dana tried the padlock, knowing it was useless. She walked around the outside and found a small window on the south wall, painted over from the inside. She looked at the roof, which was solid, better maintained than the cabin's roof, as though someone had replaced shingles more recently. She went back inside and checked the rest of the notebooks for any mention of it. In the 2003 volume, she found 3 lines. "Finished the secondary building. Put everything in order. If someone is supposed to find it, they will know how to look." She looked at the key ring. The key for the cabin was a standard brass house key. The GC, engraved on the ring she had assumed stood for Grayling Creek. She turned the ring in her fingers. Or it stood for something else. She had not thought to try the key anywhere other than the cabin door. She went back outside in the cooling October afternoon and tried the key in the padlock. It did not fit. She stood looking at the outbuilding and then at the key and then at the spruces and then at the back of the property where Elias had written the soil was different, darker and richer, running counter to the land around it. She had not looked at the assayer's notebooks carefully enough. She went back inside and sat on the bunk and took the 2003 volume out again and read it from the beginning. He had been meticulous. That was the thing about Elias. He did not leave things implicit. He recorded what needed to be recorded. The entries from early 2003 described clearing a section of the back property, leveling ground, pouring a small concrete pad. He had done most of the work himself, hiring a neighbor named Vic Paulson for one weekend to help with framing. In the June entry, he wrote, "Moved everything from the original location. Safer here. Better sealed against moisture." The combination is what it always was. The date I met Ruth. Dana sat very still. She had known this. She had been told this as a child. The date her grandparents met, which was a family story, a good one. A story about a church social in 1959 and a woman who had laughed at something Elias said before he had even finished saying it. She knew the month and the year. She was not entirely certain about the day. She called her mother. "Mom," she said, "what was the exact date that Grandpa met Grandma?" "The church social." Her mother's voice went to the particular warmth it reserved for stories about her parents. "September 14th, 1959. Why?" Dana was already walking back toward the outbuilding. "I'll explain later." She tried the combination on the rusted lock. September 14th, 59. The lock did not move. She tried it again, more carefully. Still nothing. She looked at the combination lock. It was a 4-digit model, not 3. She had been entering it wrong. She tried 0914, then 5914. Then, slowly, thinking about what a man born in 1934 might naturally default to for a combination he would need to remember, She tried the year alone, 1959. The lock opened. Inside the outbuilding, the air was cool and dry, with a particular quality that told her insulation had been installed and the structure was better sealed than it appeared from outside. Shelves ran along 3 walls, built from the same careful joinery she recognized from the cabin. On the shelves were boxes, many boxes. Some were plastic storage containers with lids snapped tight, labeled in Elias's handwriting. Others were metal tackle boxes, the large kind. A flat wooden chest sat on the floor against the back wall, padlocked, old brass. On the shelf nearest the door, sitting on top of a storage container, was an envelope. Her name on the outside. Not typewritten. Handwritten. Dana. His handwriting. She sat down on the concrete floor and opened it. His handwriting filled 3 pages, his usual precision slightly more deliberate than the notebooks, as though he had written this knowing it mattered. He had begun with something she did not expect. An apology. He was sorry he had not been more present. He was sorry for the years when she had needed someone and he had been out here on his creek, because being out here was easier than being useful in ways he did not know how to be useful. He was not good with children the way some grandfathers were. He did not know what to say when things were hard. He had thought she was doing fine, and then he had learned she was not doing fine, and by then his own health had made the question of what to do about it mostly theoretical. She stopped reading for a moment because her eyes had blurred. He had written, "I know about the marriage. Your mother tells me more than you realize. I know it went wrong in ways that were not your fault. I know you were trying to put things back together for yourself and for Maya. I want to help. I could not help when I was alive because I did not know how. I am hoping I can help now." He wrote about the land. He explained, in his careful way, what he had learned over 40 years of people coming to ask him about it. He had not been ignorant. He had understood exactly what Telluride Resources and its successors were interested in, had understood it since he hired a retired mining engineer from the state university to walk the back section with him in 1992 and explain what the fuss was about. He wrote, "The man from the university told me the mineral deposit under the eastern section was significant." His word, significant. I did not sell because I did not want it destroyed. The creek runs through the lower section, and I have watched that creek for 30 years. I know what happens to water downstream from a mine. I did not want that for this land, or for the creek, or for the people below it. He wrote, "I have been speaking with an attorney for the past 2 years. His name is Wallace Kimura and his office is in the county seat. He helped me set up something called a conservation easement on the western section and the creek corridor, which protects those areas permanently regardless of who owns the property. The eastern section, the mineralized zone, is not protected the same way. I was not ready to decide what to do with it." He wrote, "In the outbuilding you will find my records. 40 years of correspondence, survey reports, geological assessments, offers from the company. Also the boxes on the top shelf, which are not related to any of that. Those are something else I need you to see." He wrote, "I love you, Dana. I was not always good at saying that. I am saying it now. Whatever you decide to do with this property, the decision is yours. I only ask that you read my records before you decide anything. And I ask you to look at the boxes on the top shelf." The letter was signed with his full name, Elias T. Greer, the way he had always signed birthday cards. She sat on the concrete floor of the outbuilding for a long time with the letter in her hands and the October light coming through the small south window and the sound of the creek moving somewhere beyond the spruce trees, patient and continuous, the way it had always been. Then she looked at the boxes on the top shelf. They were 3 in number, each roughly the size of a shoebox, each sealed with a strip of electrical tape and labeled in his handwriting. The labels read simply, "For Dana." She lifted the first one down. It was heavier than its size suggested. She peeled back the electrical tape carefully and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of foam padding that Elias had clearly cut to fit, were coins. Not loose coins, not a jar of spare change, but coins in protective sleeves, the kind collectors use, each one individually encased in a hard plastic holder with information printed on the label. She picked one up and looked at it. Morgan's silver dollar. 1886, S, MS, 65. The S stood for the San Francisco Mint. The MS designation, she would learn later, referred to the coin's condition on a scale that went to 70, and 65 represented a coin that was as close to pristine as one could be after 130 years of existing. The label on the holder was from a company called PCGS, which she would also learn later was one of the two most respected grading services in the numismatic world. She did not know any of this yet. She only knew that she was sitting on a concrete floor holding a silver dollar from 1886 in a protective case, and that there were perhaps 40 of them in this box alone, each one nested in its own section of foam. She opened the second box. More coins, different types. Gold pieces, she realized, though she did not know the correct terminology. Round and heavy and deeply yellow in the flat light coming through the window. Some were large, the size of a silver dollar. Some were small, perhaps the size of a quarter. Each one had its own protective holder. Each holder had a grading company's label. She opened the third box. This one held paper. Not documents, not records, but currency. Old currency. Bills that were clearly not modern, their colors and designs subtly different from anything she had seen outside of a museum. They were each in individual protective sleeves. She picked one up and looked at it. $10. The design was elaborate, ornate, the kind of thing that required a magnifying glass to fully appreciate. The date printed on the face was 1901. She put the lid back on the third box and sat in the cooling air of the outbuilding and thought about her grandfather, who had driven a 10-year-old Ford pickup and worn the same 4 flannel shirts in rotation and kept his expenses so minimal that his neighbors had sometimes worried he was struggling, who had lived in a 400-square-foot cabin by a creek for 24 years after retirement and apparently spent some portion of that time quietly accumulating things that lived in foam. Padded boxes in a sealed outbuilding on land a mining company had been trying to buy for 40 years. She thought about Brandon saying, "You'll get nothing." She called Wallace Kimura from the car on the way back to the county road, where the signal finally returned. His receptionist told her he was with a client and would call back. He called back 40 minutes later, while she was still on the highway, and she told him who she was and that she had found the letter in the outbuilding. There was a brief silence on his end. He said, "Good." He wanted to make sure someone found that before anything else happened. "Can you come in Thursday?" She said she could. She did not tell her sister that night or the night after. She lay on the fold-out cot in the laundry room and stared at the ceiling and ran numbers through her head that she did not yet have enough information to make reliable, and tried not to let hope become the thing that broke her if it turned out she was wrong about what she had found. She Googled coin values from her phone in the dark. She looked at recent auction results for Morgan silver dollars in mint state condition. She looked at prices for pre-1933 U.S. gold coins. She looked at prices for large denomination national bank notes from the early 20th century. Then she put the phone face down on her chest and breathed in the smell of dryer sheets and listened to the house around her. At some point she slept. Thursday arrived. Wallace Kimura was a man in his late 60s with a calm, deliberate manner that reminded her of her grandfather, which she suspected was not coincidental. His office was orderly without being intimidating. He had photographs of fly fishing on the walls, which made her feel that Elias had chosen well. He had her sit down and offered coffee, which she accepted. Then he put a folder on the desk between them. "Your grandfather," he said, "was a careful man. He was also, over the course of about 30 years, an unexpectedly sophisticated collector. He started buying coins in the 1970s, before coin collecting became a widely recognized investment vehicle. He had good instincts and he was patient, which is essentially the entire formula for success in that field." Dana looked at the folder. "He sent the collection to PCGS for grading about 7 years ago. I have the full inventory here." He opened the folder and turned it toward her. 243 individual pieces. Coins and currency. He obtained a private appraisal 18 months ago, which is also in this folder. She looked at the appraisal page. The number at the bottom was so far outside what she had been preparing herself for that she read it 3 times to make sure she was parsing it correctly. For $1,312,000. At market values from 18 months ago, which would have shifted somewhat since, but not in a direction that made the number meaningless. She set the page down very carefully. "He also," Kimura continued, in his measured way, "retained me to document his 40 years of negotiations with Telluride Resources and its successor entities. Every offer, every communication, every survey they conducted that they shared with him, and several they conducted without sharing with him that he documented independently. The mineral rights situation is more complex than a simple appraisal, because the conversation you would be having with Meridian Extraction Group, if you chose to have it, would not be about selling the land. It would be about negotiating access rights for extraction on specific acreage while protecting the creek corridor and the western section. Dana found her voice. What would that conversation look like, in your estimation? Kimura leaned back in his chair slightly. Your grandfather refused $220,000 for the whole property in 2008. The industry has changed significantly since then. Copper demand has increased substantially due to electric vehicle manufacturing and grid infrastructure. The deposit under the eastern section, based on the updated geological assessment your grandfather commissioned 3 years ago, is estimated at roughly $18 million in recoverable mineral value at current copper prices. An access rights agreement rather than a land sale would typically yield somewhere between 20 and 40% of recoverable value, depending on negotiation. Dana was doing arithmetic. She made herself stop because the numbers were becoming unmanageable. He knew all of this, she said. It was not quite a question. He knew most of it. The updated assessment was part of why he retained me and began preparing documentation 2 years ago. He was not ready to negotiate himself. His health was declining, and he did not want to enter a complex negotiation from a weakened position. Kimura paused briefly. He also said he did not want to do it alone. He said he was waiting for family. The word moved through her in a way she could not entirely account for. He was waiting for me? He knew the property would pass to you. He had written you into the will specifically rather than leaving it to the estate generally, precisely because of what he had learned about your circumstances. He asked me, if you reached out, to tell you that. Another pause. He said he was sorry he had not been the grandfather he should have been while he was alive, and that he hoped this was something. Dana sat in the orderly office with the folder open on the desk between them and thought about a man who had spent 24 years alone on a creek in the woods, keeping composition notebooks and releasing the fish he caught, and saying no to the people who came with their trucks and their business cards and their incremental offers, who had understood what he had and chosen to protect it, and had waited, in his quiet and inadequate way, for someone to give it to. She had 40 years of documentation. She had a mineral assessment. She had a conservation easement protecting the creek and the land she cared about. She had a collection worth $4 million in a sealed outbuilding on her property. She had Kimura, who had clearly spent 2 years preparing for this conversation. And she had Dana Calloway and Gerald Pierce at $420 an hour, and the long, patient certainty with which both of them had told her she would get nothing. She looked at the folder. She said, "Tell me what we need to do first." Kimura pulled out a legal pad. "The first thing," he said, "is an updated mineral assessment. The one your grandfather commissioned is 3 years old, and the industry moves. I have a firm I work with that handles this kind of assessment regularly and can give us current numbers we can actually take into a negotiation. That takes about 3 weeks. How much does it cost? $20 to $100. Your grandfather funded an account for exactly this kind of expense." He slid a single page across the desk. A bank statement for a small account in her name. Elias had deposited $11,000 into it over the past 2 years. He set this up with me as the account manager until you were located and made contact. It transfers to your direct control today if you want it. She looked at the number in the account and thought about the $1,800 she had been prepared to spend on the mineral assessment from the list the county assessor had given her. Had been prepared to spend out of her own $3,000. She had spent weeks working up to that decision. He had already paid for it. She signed the account transfer paperwork with steady hands. After the assessment, Kimura continued, "We request a meeting with Meridian Extraction Group. They have been aware since your grandfather's death that the property passed to a new owner. I know this because their attorney called me 3 months ago to ask whether the estate was planning to sell. I told them I was not authorized to discuss the matter. They called again 6 weeks ago. I told them the same thing. They've been waiting. They've been waiting, and the waiting has cost them. The longer they go without secured access rights, the more pressure they face from their own investors. There are other deposits in the region. They have been holding resources in reserve for this one specifically because of the deposit's quality." He tapped the folder. "That gives us leverage. Your grandfather understood that. He refused to negotiate when his health was declining because he knew a weakened negotiator cedes leverage they cannot recover." Dana thought about that. About all the times in the past year when she had been weakened. The custody hearings. The apartment rejections. The fold-out cot in her sister's laundry room. The 3 jobs she had priced out and not quite been able to reach. The way the numbers never quite added up, the particular exhaustion of being a person whose circumstances were always one emergency away from collapse. What's a realistic outcome, she said. If the negotiation goes reasonably well? Kimura was quiet for a moment in the way she was learning meant he was choosing precision over speed. The deposit assessment from 3 years ago estimated $18 million in recoverable value. Copper prices have risen approximately 22% since that assessment. A current assessment may revise the figure upward. If we negotiate a 25% royalty on extraction, which is within the range of comparable agreements I have researched in this region, and if recovery takes place over the projected 10 to 12-year timeline, you are looking at total receipts of somewhere between $5.5 and $7 million, paid in installments over that period. The number hung in the air between them. Plus the collection, Dana said. Plus the collection, which is a separate asset. The land itself, with the conservation easement protecting the creek corridor, retains its value as real property. You would not be selling the land. You would be licensing access to a specific subsurface area for a defined period. She sat with all of this. She thought about a very specific morning in February when Brandon had stood at the kitchen counter with his coffee and told her that she should consult with an attorney before things got complicated, and that she should understand going in that he had protected his assets, legally and thoroughly, and that she would not be walking away with anything significant. He had said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. He had said it as a statement of fact, the way you tell someone what the weather will be. One more question, she said to Kimura. Of course. The divorce was finalized 2 weeks ago. The settlement is already recorded. Whatever comes from this property, is there any mechanism by which Brandon Calloway could claim any part of it? Kimura shook his head without hesitation. The property passed to you through inheritance. It was never marital property. No court would consider it part of the marital estate. Furthermore, because the will was executed and the property transferred before your divorce was finalized, there is no argument that it was acquired during the marriage. It is entirely, unambiguously yours. She let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 9 months. Okay, she said. Let's start. She drove home that afternoon on the highway with the radio off and the windows up and the particular silence of a person who is trying to hold something fragile steady inside themselves without letting it spill before they reach somewhere safe. She thought about how to tell Maya. Maya was 10, which was old enough to understand certain things and young enough to misunderstand others. She understood that they did not have a lot of money right now. She understood that the divorce had changed things and that some of those changes were permanent. She was perceptive in ways that sometimes caught Dana off guard. The way she had noticed when Dana was trying not to cry in the grocery store and had simply reached up and taken her hand without saying anything. The way she had never once, in all the months since February, asked why her parents could not fix things, as though she understood instinctively that some things were past fixing and the only useful response was to figure out what came next. Dana had been telling her for months that things were going to get better. She had meant it every time and had not always been able to see exactly how it would be true. Now she could see it. Not perfectly, not in the specific detail of numbers and timelines, but she could see it the way you can see the shape of a building from far enough away that you cannot yet make out the windows. She did not tell Maya that night. She needed to know more first. She needed the assessment and the negotiation and at least some of the pieces in their actual places before she said anything that would land as a promise she had to keep. But she drove out to the cabin the following Saturday with Maya and the composition notebooks and 2 sleeping bags, because it turned out there was a propane heater in the outbuilding that Elias had never mentioned in the notebooks she had read so far, and the bunk was actually big enough for 2 people if one of them was small, and the creek sounded different in the morning than it did in the afternoon, slower and darker, and she wanted Maya to hear that. They stayed 2 nights. Maya caught her second fish and released it the way Elias had apparently always done, watching it work back into the current for a moment before it found its depth and disappeared. Why do we put it back? Maya asked. Because we came to see it, not to take it. Maya considered this with the seriousness she applied to things she was genuinely thinking about. Is that why great-grandpa Elias stayed out here? To see it? Dana looked at the water. I think so. I think he wanted to make sure it stayed the way it was. And now we do that. She had not said yes to anything yet. Not to Kimura's plan, not to the negotiation, not to any version of a future she could not yet see clearly. But she looked at the creek and thought about a retired machinist keeping 40 years of composition notebooks and building a sealed outbuilding and setting up a bank account he would never use himself. And she thought about what it meant to decide, quietly and without announcement, that something was worth protecting. Yeah, she said. Now we do that. The weeks that followed had a different texture than the months before them. Not easier, exactly. The fold-out cot in the laundry room was still a fold-out cot. The budget was still the budget. Her sister still needed the $400 a month, and Dana still needed to supply it. Maya still had a dentist appointment and a school clothes situation and a field trip fee that arrived in an envelope on a Monday when Dana was already calculating whether she could push the car insurance payment by 5 days. But underneath all of it was something new. A current beneath the main channel, as her grandfather might have said. A sense that the ground she was standing on was not the ground she had thought it was. She received the updated mineral assessment 31 days after she authorized it. Paul from the geology department had been right. The numbers had moved. Copper prices were higher than 3 years prior, and a newer extraction technology had made the deposit's lower-grade sections more viable than previously estimated. The total recoverable value now stood at an estimated $23 million, up from 18. She called Kimura. He read through the assessment in silence for a moment, and she could hear the careful satisfaction of a man whose patience had been confirmed. "This is strong," he said. "This is very strong. I'll request a meeting with Meridian Extraction's legal team. I'd like to give them 1 week to prepare before we sit down with them, so they come in having had time to realize what they're looking at." 1 week, she said. "You should also," he said, more carefully, "begin thinking about what you want. Not just financially. What outcome, for yourself, for the land, for your daughter, looks like something you can build a life around. The numbers give us leverage, but what you want to do with that leverage is a question only you can answer." She drove out to the cabin after she hung up and sat on the porch steps in the November cold with her grandfather's last notebook in her lap, the one from this past year, and read the final entries. The handwriting had grown less steady toward the end, but the precision was still there, the same careful recording of water temperature and weather and the occasional brown trout. The last entry was 4 days before he died. He had written about the creek, which was running high from rain, and about a great blue heron he had watched for 20 minutes from the porch before it moved upstream and out of sight. He had written, "Good to see. They're becoming rarer." And then, below that, a single sentence that did not quite match the rest of the entry, as though he had written it at a different time or from a different part of himself. "I hope she knows she was always my favorite." Dana sat on the porch steps with the November cold settling around her and the creek running high below the trees, and let herself cry for the first time since February, which was a very long time to go without crying, and which meant that when it finally came it was not the controlled, careful crying of someone managing an emotion, but something much less organized than that, something that had been waiting for the right place to happen. She cried for Elias, who had not known how to be present, but had spent decades preparing something real. She cried for the 9 years she had spent in a marriage that had ended in a parking lot with a paper bag and a key. She cried for Maya, who had handled all of it better than a 10-year-old should have to. And then she stopped, because the creek was still running, and there was work to do. The meeting with Meridian Extraction Group was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a glass building in the city that overlooked a parking structure and, beyond it, a thin slice of river. Dana wore her best blazer, the navy one she had bought 2 years ago for a dental conference and had not worn since. She had pressed it the night before with Maya's help, Maya holding the fabric taut while Dana ran the iron in careful strokes, both of them treating the task with the solemnity it deserved. Kimura met her in the lobby at 8:50. He was carrying a briefcase she had not seen before, larger than his usual one, and he wore a tie, which told her he considered this consequential. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like myself," she said, which was the truest answer she could give. Not confident exactly, not calm exactly, but grounded in a way she had not felt in a long time, as though the past 3 months had returned her to some earlier version of herself that the marriage had slowly displaced. "Good," he said. "That's exactly right." They went up in the elevator. The Meridian team was already in the conference room when they entered. There were 4 of them. A man in his mid-50s named Robert Crane, who was introduced as the company's vice president of acquisitions and who had the broad-shouldered, permanently tanned look of someone who had spent decades in resource extraction. Beside him sat a woman named Sandra Holt, the company's lead attorney, who had short gray hair and the calm, appraising manner of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and immediately understanding where the power was. Two others flanked them, younger, with laptops open and the focused attentiveness of people whose job was to record what happened rather than shape it. Crane shook Dana's hand across the table. His grip was firm in a way that was clearly practiced, calibrated to signal confidence without crossing into aggression. "Miss Calloway," he said, "thank you for making time. We've been looking forward to this conversation." "So have I," she said. She sat. Kimura sat beside her. She put her folder on the table, but did not open it. Crane opened with what she recognized as a prepared statement, walking through Meridian's history in the region, their environmental record, their commitment to responsible extraction, their long-standing interest in the Grayling Creek watershed. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes without interruption, in the fluent, rehearsed way of someone who had delivered this particular speech before. When he finished, he folded his hands on the table and looked at her with an expression of open, patient interest. "We understand you've had some time to familiarize yourself with the property. We're hoping we can find a path forward. That works for everyone." Dana waited a beat longer than was comfortable. Then she said, "What is Meridian's current valuation of the mineral deposit on the eastern section of the property?" A brief pause on their side of the table. Holt's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted slightly. Crane said, "We want to conduct our own current assessment before putting a specific number on it." "That's reasonable," Dana said. "I've already conducted one." She opened her folder and slid the assessment across the table. "Updated 6 weeks ago. $23 million in recoverable value at current copper prices." Crane looked at the document without reaching for it. Holt picked it up. "We want to have our own people verify that," Crane said. "Of course. I'd expect nothing less." Dana kept her voice even, not aggressive, not conciliatory, just present. "I want to be clear about what I'm here to discuss. I'm not interested in selling the property. The land will remain in my family. What I'm prepared to discuss is a long-term access rights agreement for the eastern section specifically, with defined environmental protections for the creek corridor and the western acreage, which is already under conservation easement." She paused. "And I want to understand, before we go further, why Meridian has been pursuing this particular deposit for 37 years. The question landed differently than Crane had been expecting. She could see it in the way his expression reorganized itself, recalibrating from the negotiation he had prepared for to the one actually in front of him. Holt set the assessment back on the table and looked at Kimura, then at Dana. "That's a very specific number. 37 years. My grandfather kept records," Dana said. "Very thorough records. Beginning with a visit from a man in a Telluride Resources truck in November of 1987. Another beat. The deposit," Holt said carefully, "has specific mineral characteristics that make it particularly valuable for a type of extraction process Meridian has been developing for approximately a decade. The copper content is high-grade relative to comparable regional deposits, and the geological formation allows for a lower-impact extraction method that reduces environmental remediation costs significantly. Which is why the economics have improved." "Yes." "And why you've been patient." Holt met her eyes. "Yes." Dana nodded. She had thought about this conversation many times in the weeks since she had authorized the assessment. She had run it forward and backward in her mind, considering what Meridian would want, what they would offer first, what their actual ceiling was, what her own floor was, and what shape a workable agreement might take. She had also thought about her grandfather, who had spent 37 years saying no, and about why he had said no, and about what yes would need to look like if she was going to say it. She said, "Here is what I need you to understand about this property before we discuss terms. My grandfather chose not to sell this land despite offers that increased over 4 decades. His reason was not ignorance of its value. He understood exactly what was under the eastern section. His reason was the creek." She paused. "Grayling Creek runs through the western section of the property and feeds into a watershed that serves 4 downstream communities. My grandfather watched that creek for 30 years. He documented the water quality, the fish population, the way the water table responded to weather patterns. He knew what happens downstream from an extraction operation. That was his line." She looked at Crane directly. That line is also my line. The creek corridor is protected by conservation easement, and that does not change. The western section does not change. What I'm prepared to discuss is the eastern section only, under an agreement with real environmental monitoring requirements, real remediation bonding, and real consequences for violations. Not language that sounds like environmental protection. Actual protection. Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he glanced at Holt, and something passed between them that was too quick for Dana to fully read, but that felt like confirmation of something they had already discussed. We can work with that framework, Crane said. They talked for 2 more hours. By the time the meeting ended, they had not signed anything, but they had the shape of something. A term sheet to be drafted over the following 3 weeks. A 28% royalty on gross extraction value, which was at the high end of Kimura's projected range. An environmental monitoring program with an independent third-party overseer agreed in principle. A remediation bond of $2 million held in escrow before extraction began. Annual reporting requirements with Dana holding the right to suspend operations if monitoring thresholds were exceeded. In the elevator going down, Kimura was quiet until the doors opened to the lobby. "You did very well," he said. "My grandfather did very well," she said. 37 years ago. She drove home through December traffic with the heat on and the radio off and thought about calling her mother. Then she thought about the right order to do things. Her mother would tell her sister. Her sister would tell her husband. Her husband would mention it at a party. She had spent the past several months watching information travel through those channels, and she needed to control this particular piece of information until it was something solid enough to hold. She called Jess instead, her friend who called every Sunday, the one person outside of Kimura she trusted completely. Jess answered on the second ring. "What happened? I can hear it in your breathing. I need to tell you something, but you cannot tell anyone." "Dana, I mean it. I know you mean it. Tell me." She told her. Not all of it. Not the numbers. Not yet. Because even with Jess some things needed to stay small until they were real. But enough. The cabin. The outbuilding. The collection. The deposit. The meeting that had just ended on the 14th floor. Jess was quiet for long enough that Dana checked her phone to see if the call had dropped. "Jess. I'm here. I'm processing. I'm trying not to say something that will seem inadequate given what you just told me. You can just say what you're thinking. I'm thinking about Brandon standing in your kitchen in February telling you that you would get nothing." Jess's voice went low and steady, the way it did when she was genuinely angry. "And I'm thinking about how he's going to feel when he finds out." Dana pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store she was not actually planning to go into, because she needed to stop the car. "He's not going to find out. Not from me. Not for a while." "Does his attorney know about the cabin?" "It was never marital property." Kimura confirmed that. Inherited assets don't enter the marital estate. "So he gets nothing." The phrase reversed itself in Dana's mind. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "It's not about him getting nothing. It's about me having something. That's different." Jess was quiet again. Then, "Your grandfather sounds like he was something." "He was. I just didn't know it in time." "You know it now." She drove home and made dinner and helped Maya with a science project about water cycles, which involved a glass jar and plastic wrap and a heat lamp, and produced a small but genuine demonstration of condensation that Maya photographed from 3 different angles for her report. Dana watched her daughter move around the kitchen table with the focused delight of someone doing something that actually interested her, and thought about the list she had written in her notebook sitting on the porch of the cabin. She had written several things on that list. A home, the kind with a yard and a second bathroom and a street where Maya could ride a bike. A position at a dental practice where she might eventually make partner rather than staying as a hygienist indefinitely. Maya's college, which was a number she had been putting off looking at directly. The cabin itself, which she wanted to keep, to repair properly, to make the place Elias had wanted it to be. She had also written, at the bottom of the page, one thing she had not written for any practical reason, but simply because it was true. "I want to sit on that porch and feel like I did something right." She had not told Kimura about that one, but she thought Elias would have understood it immediately. The term sheet arrived 18 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, via email to Kimura, who forwarded it to Dana with a cover note that said simply, "First pass. They've been reasonable. There are 3 points I want to push back on. Call me." She called him. The 3 points were technical, relating to the specific language around environmental thresholds, and what constituted a monitoring violation sufficient to trigger operation suspension. Meridian's first draft had written those thresholds loosely. Kimura wanted them tightened to specific measurable standards rather than general language that a company's lawyers could later argue around. He was right. She told him so. He drafted a response and sent it back. The back and forth on the term sheet took another 2 weeks. During that time, Dana moved into the cabin. Not permanently, not with all of her belongings, but with enough to make it functional through the winter. She drove out on a Saturday with Maya and 2 carloads of things and spent 3 days making the 400 square feet into something that could actually sustain 2 people. She hired a plumber from the nearest town to install a small bathroom in what had been a storage alcove off the main room. It cost $3,000, which she paid from Elias's account, and which produced a bathroom that was approximately the size of a closet, but contained a toilet and a shower that actually worked, which made Maya's assessment of the cabin upgrade from kind of cool to legitimately livable. She fixed the porch herself, with help from YouTube and a hardware store 2 towns over, and a significant expenditure of afternoons she would have otherwise spent on the fold-out cot thinking about her bank balance. She replaced the rotted support post. She reinforced the joist from below. She replaced the boards that had gone punky and soft. The porch still sagged very slightly on the right side, but it no longer sagged in a way that suggested imminent structural failure, and it was solid enough to put a chair on, which was all she needed. She moved 2 chairs onto the porch, one for herself and one for Maya, who had been increasingly resistant to returning to her sister's house and had started referring to the cabin as ours rather than great-grandpa's, which Dana took as a significant development. They sat on the porch in the December cold wrapped in blankets and watched the creek and talked about things that were easier to talk about out here than they were in her sister's house, with its thin walls and its 2 other adults moving around just beyond earshot. They talked about school, which Maya was doing better in than she let on. They talked about Maya's father, carefully, the way they always did, navigating the specific terrain of not saying things that were true, but not useful, and not saying things that were false just because they were easier. They talked about Elias, about what Dana had learned from his notebooks, about the creek, and why he had loved it. Do you think he was lonely? Maya asked one evening. Dana thought about it. About the 2 chairs on this same porch that Elias had sat alone in for 24 years. About the great blue heron he had watched for 20 minutes 4 days before he died. I think he was the kind of person who chose solitude because it was where he fit best. That's different from lonely, is it? I think so. Lonely is when you want company and don't have it. He wanted this. She gestured at the creek, the trees, the dark water. He had it. Maya pulled her blanket tighter. I don't want to be like that when I'm old. You won't be. You're nothing like that already. Maya smiled, briefly and genuinely, the smile that still looked exactly the way it had when she was 4 years old. What are you going to do with the cabin? Like, permanently? Dana had been thinking about this. Keep it. Fix it up properly in the spring. Maybe use it on weekends, the way your great-grandpa did. Can I bring friends out here? When the bathroom's a little bigger. Maya laughed. It was a good sound in the cold December air. The final term sheet arrived on a Thursday in late January. Kimura had pushed successfully on all 3 of his points. The environmental thresholds were now specific and measurable. The remediation bond had increased to $2.5 million. The independent monitoring program had teeth. Dana read through every page twice, then called Kimura and asked him to walk her through the section she had questions about, and then sat with it for 24 hours before calling him back. She said, I'm ready to sign. Good. I'll arrange execution for next week. She called Jess that night. It's real, she said. Jess was quiet for a moment. What does that feel like? Dana looked out the window of the cabin, which she was at alone because Maya was back at her sister's for the school week. The creek was visible through the birches, moving slow in the cold, a thin skim of ice along the edges, but the center still open and running. It feels like standing on ground that's actually solid. Like I'd been walking on something that could give way any moment for so long I forgot what solid felt like. Did you eat today? Yes. Did you sleep last night? Mostly. Dana. I know. I'm fine. I'm genuinely fine, Jess. That's the thing. I'm not performing fine. I'm actually fine. Another pause. Brandon's going to hear about this eventually. I know. What are you going to say when he does? She looked at the creek for a moment. Nothing. There's nothing to say. He made his assessment, and he was wrong. That's not my problem to explain to him. The signing happened on a Wednesday morning in Kimura's office rather than the glass building downtown, which felt right to her. The Meridian team sent Holt and one of the younger associates. The documents were thick, the kind of thick that meant people had spent serious time on them, which Dana appreciated. She read every page before she signed any of them. Holt sat across the table watching her do this with an expression that started as impatience and settled, over the course of 45 minutes, into something that looked like respect. When everything was signed and dated and witnessed, and the original copies were distributed, Holt extended her hand across the table. Your grandfather held out a long time, she said. He knew what he had. So do you. Holt's handshake was firm and brief. I look forward to a productive relationship. Dana drove to the cabin directly afterward. She did not go to her sister's house first. She did not stop to call anyone. She drove the highway and then the county road, and then the 2-tire tracks through the grass, and parked at the edge of the clearing and walked down to the creek. The ice along the edges had thickened since the week before. The center channel was still open, running dark and steady under a sky the color of old silver. She stood on the bank where she had stood with Elias when she was 11 years old, and he had told her to watch the water, to learn to read the current, to find the spots that nobody else thought to look at. She stood there for a long time. Then she went inside and made coffee on the propane burner and sat at the small table and did the arithmetic she had been avoiding doing precisely because she needed it to be real before she calculated it. The royalty rate was 28%. The deposit's recoverable value was estimated at $23 million. The extraction timeline was projected at 10 to 12 years. Payment would come quarterly based on actual extraction volume, which meant the early years would be smaller as operations ramped up and the middle years would be larger. Kimura's estimate for total receipts over the full term ranged between $6.4 and $7.2 million, plus the collection, for $1,300,000 at the 18-month-old appraisal. Current market values for the specific pieces, based on her own research and the gentle counsel of a numismatic specialist Kimura had connected her with, suggested the figure was closer to $4,700,000 now. She was not going to liquidate the collection. She had decided this weeks ago, sitting in the outbuilding with Elias's foam-padded boxes in her lap. She was going to have it properly inventoried, insured, and stored. She was going to let it continue to do what it had been doing for 30 years, which was appreciate quietly in a sealed room where nobody knew it existed. Maybe someday she would sell pieces. Maybe someday Maya would. That was a decision for people with time to make it. The cabin itself, with the conservation easement protecting the creek corridor, was assessed now at something closer to $80,000 than the $31,000 it had started at, because the assessed values for properties in the area had increased, and because the bathroom she had added counted for something. It was not a large number, but it was hers, free and clear, on 7 acres that included a creek her grandfather had loved. She wrote the numbers in her composition notebook. She added them. She looked at the total. She had told Brandon, in that February kitchen, that she needed to think about things. He had said there was nothing to think about. He had said the numbers were what they were. He had said she should consult with an attorney, but to understand going in that there was very little room for negotiation. She closed the notebook. She drove back to her sister's house that evening and told Maya first, before she told anyone else, because that was the right order. Maya was at the kitchen table doing homework when Dana came in. She looked up and something in Dana's face made her put down her pencil. What happened? Dana sat down across from her. You know how I've been dealing with some things related to the cabin? Legal things? The mining company. Dana had told her some of it. Not the numbers, but the shape of it. She had decided that Maya was old enough to understand that there was a negotiation happening and that it mattered. Yes, I signed an agreement today. It means that the cabin is going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Maya looked at her with those dark eyes that always seemed to be processing slightly more than the conversation required. How okay? Dana thought about how to say it. About the right words for a 10-year-old who had spent the past 11 months being told, in various ways, that things were uncertain and that she needed to be patient and that her mother was working on it. Very okay, she said. The kind of okay where we can stop worrying about the things we've been worrying about. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Are we going to move to the cabin? Not permanently, but we're going to fix it up properly. And we're going to get our own place. A real one, with a yard. And a bathroom that isn't in a closet? And a bathroom that isn't in a closet. Maya picked up her pencil and looked at her homework and then looked back at Dana. Great-grandpa Elias did this, didn't he? Like, this is because of him. Yes. I wish I had known him better. Dana reached across the table and put her hand over Maya's. Me too. But I think this is how he knew us. This is what he could give. Maya turned her hand over and held on. They sat like that for a while, at the kitchen table in her sister's house, while the smell of dinner came from the next room, and the winter dark pressed against the windows, and something that had been very tight in Dana's chest for 11 months began, slowly, to release. She told her sister that evening. Her sister sat on the couch and listened to the abbreviated version, the cabin, the mineral deposit, the negotiation, the agreement. She did not say anything for a long moment after Dana finished. Then she said, I always thought that old man was sharp. I just didn't know what he was sharp about. She told her mother the following day, on the phone, and her mother cried in the particular way that mothers cry when something they have been afraid of for their child turns out to be unnecessary fear, and then asked immediately if Dana was eating properly, which Dana took as a sign that things were returning to normal. She did not tell Brandon. She would not tell Brandon. There was nothing to tell him. The property had never been marital property. The agreement was hers. The collection was hers. The cabin and the 7 acres and the creek and the 40 years of composition notebooks were all hers, passed to her by a man who had spent 37 years saying no to people with trucks and business cards and incremental offers, who had understood exactly what he had and had chosen, very deliberately, who to give it to. Brandon would hear about it eventually. These things always moved through enough channels that they reached the people who were least supposed to know them. And when he did, Dana intended to say nothing. The only sentence she had considered, and then set aside, was something her grandfather had written in his 1994 notebook after the latest visit from the Telluride resources representative. He had written, "Some things are worth more than what people offer for them." That was sufficient. That was the whole thing. She drove out to the cabin the following Saturday with Maya and a bag of groceries and her grandfather's composition notebooks, and spent 3 days there. On the second morning, they woke early and walked down to the creek before breakfast, bundled in the good coats Dana had been able to buy in December, and stood on the bank while the light came gray, and then silver, and then, briefly, gold through the birches. A great blue heron was working the far bank. It stood in the shallow water with the absolute stillness of something that had learned patience as a survival strategy, watching the creek with the specific attention of an animal that knew exactly what it was looking for. Maya grabbed Dana's arm without speaking and pointed. They watched the heron for a long time. It did not catch anything while they were there. Eventually, it spread its enormous wings and lifted off the water with a few slow beats and disappeared upstream, around the bend where the creek curved out of sight. Maya exhaled. That was incredible. Your great-grandpa saw one 4 days before he died, Dana said. The last thing he wrote about. Maya looked upstream where the heron had gone. He saw this exact heron. Maybe. I think it's the same one. Maya said it with the certainty of a 10-year-old who has decided something is true, which is the most absolute certainty there is. I think it's been here the whole time. Dana looked at the creek running cold and dark in the early light and thought about patience. About the kind of patience that was not passive, not resignation, but something else entirely, something closer to trust. Trust that what you were protecting was worth protecting. Trust that the right person would find it. She thought about a man in his 50s in 1987, saying no to a company with a truck and a logo, and saying it again and again and again for 37 years, keeping his notebooks and releasing his fish and watching his creek and waiting. She put her arm around Maya's shoulders. "Come on," she said. "Let's make breakfast." They walked back up the bank toward the cabin, through the birches, the creek sound following them all the way. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Spring came to Grayling Creek the way it comes to places that have been cold long enough that warmth feels like a revelation. First, the ice along the creek edges dissolved, the center current picking up speed as the snowmelt from the hills above sent new volume through the channel. Then the birches showed the first pale green of new leaves, tentative and thin as tissue, trembling in the April wind. Then the ground softened and the ramps pushed up through the leaf litter on the bank, and the water temperature climbed to the point where the fish, dormant since November, began to move again. Dana was there for most of it. She had given notice at the dental practice in March, 2 months after the term sheet was signed and the first royalty payment structure was confirmed. She had given 4 weeks' notice rather than 2 because Carol had been good to her, and because the practice had been her stability through the worst of the past year, and she wanted to leave it right. Carol had hugged her on her last day. "Whatever you're going into next, it's going to be better," she said. "You've got that look." What look? The look of someone who finally landed where they were supposed to be. She had applied to 3 dental practices in the county closest to the cabin, reasoning that she could commute from there until she found the right property close by, and that she wanted to stay near the land rather than treating it as a weekend destination. 2 of the practices had offered her positions. She had taken the one that offered a partnership track, even though the salary in year 1 was lower, because the difference would be made up in ways that mattered over time. She had also hired a contractor named Pete Swanson, who came recommended by the county extension office and who had the particular competence of a man who had spent 30 years fixing old buildings and understood that old buildings wanted to stand. They just needed someone to help them do it. He assessed the cabin in March and came back with a list organized by priority and a budget organized by honesty. "The bones are excellent," he said. "Your grandfather built this to last. The issues are all surface. Roof needs new flashings and maybe 30% of the shingles replaced. Foundation is solid. The addition for the bathroom is good work. The electrical needs upgrading. You've got an old system that wasn't designed for year-round habitation." He looked at his list. "And you need insulation in the walls, which means going in from the outside, which is the messy part. But it's all doable." "How long?" 8 weeks if we don't hit surprises. 10 if we do." "Do you usually hit surprises?" He smiled the smile of a contractor who has learned not to promise. "Sometimes." The work started in April. Dana stayed in a rented room in a house in the nearest town during the weeks when the cabin was most actively under construction, driving out every morning to watch the progress and make decisions as they came up. She brought Maya on weekends, letting her see the transformation, which Maya documented obsessively with her phone camera, photographing every stage of the roof work and the insulation installation, and the day Pete's crew pulled the old aluminum wiring out of the walls and replaced it with modern copper. Copper, which was also coming out of the ground on the eastern section of her 7 acres, where Meridian's survey crew had arrived in April to begin the preliminary work before extraction operations were permitted to start. They were required under the agreement to use the access road on the northern boundary, away from the creek corridor, and the first vehicle Dana saw coming down that road had Meridian Extraction Group stenciled on the door in the same restrained corporate font she recognized from their letterhead. She watched it from the porch, which was now solid and level, and held 2 proper wooden chairs that she had bought at an estate sale in town. She felt the watching of it as a complex thing. This was not what her grandfather would have chosen. He had said no specifically because of what happened downstream from a mine. She had negotiated protections he had not had access to negotiating, independent monitoring and measurable thresholds, and a $2.5 million remediation bond. And Kimura had been thorough, and the agreement had teeth. But she understood that Elias had known something she was still learning, which was that protecting what you loved meant accepting trade-offs you did not like, and that the trade-off she had made was the one that would let her keep the creek and the cabin and the western section and the birches and the ground Elias had walked for 30 years. She had made the best decision she could with the information she had, in a situation she had not chosen, and she would monitor it carefully for as long as it ran. That was all anyone could do. She wrote this in her composition notebook, not as resolution but as reminder. The cabin was finished in June, exactly as Pete had predicted if they did not hit surprises, which they had not, mostly. The new roof shingles were charcoal gray against the weathered cedar. The walls held heat properly now, and the old propane heater in the corner had been supplemented by a clean-burning wood insert in the fireplace that Pete had restored from a state of partial collapse into something functional and beautiful. The electrical system was modern. There was a proper bathroom. The porch was solid. It looked like itself. That was the thing that mattered. It did not look renovated in the way that suggested something trying to be something else. It looked like a cabin that had been cared for properly, which was what Elias had wanted for it, and had not always been able to provide in his last years when his health made the upkeep difficult. On the first weekend after Pete finished, Dana drove out with Maya and Jess's daughter Cara, who was 12 and who had been Maya's closest friend since third grade, and who had driven the 50 minutes to the cabin with the focused excitement of a child arriving somewhere important. They cooked dinner on the propane stove and ate on the porch, and then sat outside in the June dark watching fireflies move through the birches along the creek, which was something Dana had not seen since she was a child, and which produced in all four of them a quiet that was not absence but fullness. "Your grandfather built this?" Jess said. "He bought the land and built the cabin. 1962. He built something that lasted 60 years. He did." Jess looked at the creek, which was audible in the dark, the June water running fast and full with the last of the snowmelt. "That seems like enough. For a life. To build something that lasts 60 years and still holds." Dana thought about Elias in 1962, 30 years old, buying 7 acres on a creek he had found somewhere and fallen in love with in the way that people fall in love with specific places, not because they are objectively beautiful, but because they are exactly right for who you are at the moment you encounter them. Building a cabin with his machinist's hands, precise and economical, built to last because he could not see the point of building things that did not. "It's more than enough," Dana said. "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." The conversation with Brandon happened in July, which was later than she had expected and sooner than she had hoped. He called her on a Tuesday afternoon when she was at the dental practice, 3 patients into her afternoon schedule. She let it go to voicemail and listened to it that evening sitting on the cabin porch. He said, "I've been hearing things about your grandfather's property. I think we need to talk." His voice was the voice he used when he was trying to sound reasonable, which was a particular register she had learned to recognize precisely because it sounded nothing like his actual reasonable voice. His actual reasonable voice was warmer. This voice was controlled, measured, each word placed deliberately, like a man walking across ice. She called him back the following evening. "What have you been hearing?" she said, when he answered. "That there's some kind of mineral agreement. That it's significant. Where are you hearing this? Does that matter?" "It matters because I'd like to know who's discussing my business." A pause. He would not tell her. "Is it true?" She thought about what to say. She had prepared for this conversation in the abstract, and now that it was actually happening it felt both exactly as she had expected and completely different. The way real things are never quite the dimension of the imagined version. "My grandfather left me his property," she said. "I've managed that property according to my own judgment. That's not something I owe you a conversation about." The divorce settlement. The property was never part of the marital estate. Kimura's been clear about that from the beginning. It was inherited property. There's no claim. If there's a significant financial instrument that existed prior to the divorce, Brandon. She said his name once, quietly, and he stopped. "There is nothing to discuss. I would recommend you speak to Pierce if you have questions about the legality. He will tell you the same thing. The property was never marital property. The settlement is complete and recorded." Another pause, longer this time. "You could have said something," he said, and the controlled register cracked slightly, just enough that she could hear what was underneath it, which was not anger exactly, but something more complicated, a kind of disbelief that the situation had resolved itself in a way that excluded him. She thought about saying, "I didn't know when you laughed me out of that kitchen in February." She thought about saying, "I found it on my own." She thought about a dozen things she had held in reserve for this moment, and now, in the actual moment, none of them seemed worth the breath. She said, "Take care of yourself, Brandon." She hung up. She sat on the porch in the July evening with the phone in her hand and the sound of the creek below her and the fireflies already beginning to move through the birches, earlier each night as the summer deepened. She waited to feel something dramatic, something complete, some version of what movies suggested this moment should feel like, a righteous settling, a vindication with weight and ceremony. What she felt instead was tired, and then relieved that she was tired rather than wounded, and then quietly, solidly satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with Brandon at all, and everything to do with the porch under her, and the creek below her, and the notebooks on the shelf inside, and the 7 acres her grandfather had spent 37 years protecting because he had understood, in his quiet, and economical way that some things were worth more than what people offered for them. She put the phone in her pocket. She went inside and poured a glass of water from the new tap, the one connected to the well that had been tested and retested and confirmed clean, the water that came from the same ground the creek came from, cold and clear and tasting of nothing except itself. She drank it standing at the window, looking out at the birches and the last light coming through them. Then she sat down at the small table and opened her composition notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, "What comes next?" And below that, she began to write. The first royalty payment from Meridian arrived in August, as scheduled, transferred directly into the account Kimura had set up for the purpose. It was smaller than the payments would eventually be, because the extraction operation was in its early ramp-up phase and the volumes were modest while the infrastructure was being established. But the number in the account was real, confirmed by the bank statement she pulled up on her phone while sitting at the kitchen table at the cabin on the morning it cleared. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she transferred the amount she had calculated from Maya's college account, which was the first thing on her list and the thing she had been thinking about with the particular dread of a parent doing arithmetic about a future she could not yet see clearly. The transfer took approximately 30 seconds. The dread, which had been sitting in her chest since roughly February of the previous year, did not disappear entirely, but it moved. It became something smaller, something manageable, something she no longer needed to keep separate from all her other thoughts to avoid looking at directly. She called her accountant, a woman named Ellen who had been doing Dana's taxes for 6 years and who had heard about the cabin situation in pieces, because Dana had been careful about what she said and to whom, but who had now seen enough of the full picture to understand its scope. The quarterly payments will continue for the projected extraction period, Dana told her. Kimura's estimate is 10 to 12 years. Ellen was quiet in the way she always was when numbers arrived that required reorganizing the shape of a conversation she had been having in one register and now needed to continue in another. "Okay," she said. "We're going to want to structure this carefully. There are implications for how the royalty income is categorized and taxed, and there are strategies for the collection that we should talk about before you make any decisions about it. I'm not selling the collection. Not yet, and maybe not ever, but we should talk about it as an asset regardless." They scheduled a meeting for the following week. Dana wrote it in her calendar and then sat looking at the entry, thinking about the version of herself who had been making dental hygienist appointments and calculating whether she could push the car insurance payment by 5 days, and trying to connect that version to this one, the one sitting at the kitchen table in a cabin with a solid roof and a working bathroom and a creek outside that she was responsible for protecting. They were the same person. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Nothing fundamental had changed except the ground she was standing on, and even that had always been there, under the dirt road and the sagging porch and the rusted padlock, the same ground Elias had walked for 30 years, waiting for her to come back and stand on it. She called her mother that afternoon. Her mother picked up on the first ring, which was unusual, and Dana realized she had been expecting the call, the way mothers do when they are paying close attention. "First payment came through," Dana said. A long breath from her mother's end. "Baby, I know. He would be so proud of you. He set it up so I couldn't fail," Dana said. "The only thing I had to do was show up." "That's not nothing," her mother said. "A lot of people don't show up." She thought about that for a long time after she hung up. About showing up. About the 40-minute drive on a Saturday in September to look at a sagging cabin with her daughter's face pressed against the window glass. About the hour and a half in the county records office with Dorothea and the manila folder. About Paul from the geology department and the $1,800 assessment she had been prepared to pay and did not have to. About Kimura's office and Elias's account already set up and waiting, and the 3 weeks of back and forth on the term sheet, and the porch she had rebuilt with her own hands on her own afternoons. She had shown up, again and again, in the specific ways that the situation had required, without knowing in advance what the next requirement would be. She went back to her notebook and looked at what she had written under what comes next. The list was practical, the way her lists always were. A property to rent closer to the cabin and the new dental practice, somewhere with enough space for Maya, and a yard that did not require a security deposit she could not manage. A schedule for the remaining composition notebooks she had not yet read, because she had gotten through roughly half of them, and there were more years of Elias's thinking she had not yet absorbed. A visit to the numismatic specialist Kimura had recommended, to have the collection properly cataloged and insured and stored in a facility that could actually protect it, because the outbuilding was good, but it was not a climate-controlled vault. She had also written, at the bottom, in smaller letters as though she was not entirely sure it belonged there, find out what the conservation easement allows for educational use. She had been thinking about this for a while, in the way she thought about things she was not yet ready to speak aloud. The creek was a teaching tool. She knew this from her own experience at 11 years old, from the way Elias had explained the current and the water temperature and the relationship between what happened upstream and what appeared downstream weeks later. She thought about the county extension office, about whether there was a program for school groups, about whether the cabin and the protected western section and the creek itself could be a place where children came to learn something about water and patience and the particular intelligence of paying attention to the natural world. She did not know if this was possible. She did not know if it was something she would actually pursue or simply something she imagined pursuing. The way people imagine things they mean to do someday, and sometimes do and sometimes don't. But she wrote it down, because Elias had taught her that writing things down was how you kept them from disappearing. The second royalty payment came in November, larger than the first as the operation ramped up, and Dana handled it with the same order she had established. The college account first, then the agreed-upon contribution to the conservation fund she had set up in consultation with the county environmental office, then the quarterly meeting with Ellen to review the tax structure and the overall financial picture. Ellen had, over the course of 3 meetings, moved from professional calm through visible surprise and settled now into something that looked like genuine investment. She had restructured her own approach to Dana's account 3 times as the picture clarified, and at the most recent meeting she had said, with the precision of a person giving an honest assessment, "You are going to be fine for a very long time. You should know that explicitly." Dana had nodded and written it in her notebook, because it was the kind of thing you needed written down. She drove to the cabin in November to read the last of Elias's composition notebooks, the ones she had not yet gotten to, the middle years, 1995 through 2005, the decade when he had apparently been most active in his correspondence with various representatives of Telluride Resources and its successor companies. She read them chronologically, in order, sitting on the porch in a down jacket with a thermos of coffee and the creek running gray and cold below her in the November light. The middle-year notebooks were different in tone from the early ones and the later ones. The early notebooks had the quality of a man settling into a place and learning to read it. The later notebooks, the ones from his last decade, had the reflective quality of someone looking back over what he had built. The middle notebooks were more active, more alert, written by a man who was engaged in something he considered a genuine fight. He had been canny about it. That was the word that came to her as she read through the 1997 entries, where he documented a conversation with a Telluride representative named Whitmore, who had come in a different truck this time, a nicer one, and had offered to walk the property with Elias to help him understand its potential value. Elias had agreed, and had spent the entire walk asking questions that he then recorded in precise detail, extracting information from Whitmore about the deposit's characteristics and the company's interest without ever indicating that he was gathering intelligence rather than simply being a curious old man. He had written afterward, "Whitmore thinks I don't understand what I'm sitting on. He's trying to be helpful. Let him be helpful. Every answer he gives me is one less thing I have to figure out on my own." She laughed out loud on the porch, alone in November, which was a good feeling. She read through the 2001 notebook and the 2002 notebook and found in the 2003 entries the ones that described his decision to hire the mining engineer and have the back section properly assessed. He had not told anyone he was doing this. He had paid for it himself, quietly, and received the results and spent several weeks thinking about them before writing anything down. When he finally wrote about it, he had spent 2 paragraphs on the numbers and then, in the 3rd paragraph, written something she read 3 times. He had written, "I know what this means for whoever comes after me. I should have thought about this sooner. I was so focused on saying no that I didn't make a plan for what came next. I'm making one now. Better late than not at all. Better late than not at all." He had been 69 when he wrote that. She was 38 when she found it. She closed the notebook and looked at the creek. The light was coming gray and low through the birches, the November afternoon doing what November afternoons did. A kingfisher, small and bright in the flat light, flew low over the water and disappeared around the bend. Better late than not at all. He had been 69 when he wrote that. She was 38 when she found it. She closed the notebook and looked at the creek. The light was going, gray and low through the birches. A kingfisher flew low over the water and disappeared around the bend. She poured the last of the coffee from the thermos and drank it looking at the water. The same water Elias had watched for 30 years. The same current. The same cold that came off it even in the last warmth of the year. She thought about something he had written in one of the early notebooks, 1989, the year the Telluride truck had come back for the second time, and he had said no again. He had written it not about the company or the money or the deposit, but simply about the creek. He had written, "A thing worth having is worth the patience it takes to keep it." She had been 38 years old, sitting on a porch in November, and she had finally understood what her grandfather had spent his life teaching. She sat until the light was fully gone and the creek was only a sound in the dark. Then she went inside, turned on the lamp, and made dinner. Outside, the water kept moving through the cold November night, patient and continuous and entirely itself, the way it had always been, long before anyone had thought to assign it a value or argue over who it belonged to, and long after this particular story had found its ending. The idea about the creek and the school groups did not stay theoretical for long. It started the way most things in Dana's life had started in the past year, with a practical problem that turned out to be a door. The practical problem was Maya's science teacher. His name was Mr. Adler, and he had assigned his 7th grade class a watershed study that required field observation of a living waterway. The school had used a municipal retention pond for this purpose for the past 4 years, which was fine for some of what the curriculum required and almost completely useless for the rest of it, because a retention pond in a parking lot was not a watershed. It was a puddle with ambitions. Maya had mentioned the assignment at dinner one evening in the farmhouse, not with any particular intent, but simply because it was on her mind, and Dana had said, without thinking about it first, "The creek is a watershed. We could ask Mr. Adler." Maya had looked at her the way she looked at things that were obvious in retrospect. "Can I tell him tomorrow? Let me call the school first." She called the school. She spoke to Mr. Adler, who had the particular enthusiasm of a science teacher who had been making the retention pond work for 4 years and had never stopped wishing for something better. She described the cabin, the 7 acres, the conservation easement, the protected creek corridor. She described the specific features of the watershed, the way the creek responded to seasonal changes, the fish population, the way the soil along the bank indicated the underground water table. She described Elias's notebooks, which contained 40 years of observation data on water temperature, clarity, and biological indicators. Mr. Adler was quiet for a moment and then said, "When can we come?" The first school visit happened in March, 14 months after the morning Dana had found the outbuilding. 11 7th graders arrived in 2 cars driven by Mr. Adler and a parent volunteer named Teresa, who wore sensible boots and immediately began asking questions about the conservation easement with the focused interest of someone who worked in environmental policy, which she did. Dana had spent the previous 2 weekends preparing. She had printed copies of the original survey map from the county records office, the one from 1892 that showed the creek's path and the property boundaries. She had pulled the water temperature data from Elias's notebooks and organized it by decade, so the students could see how the creek had changed and not changed over 40 years. She had written a simple guide to reading the current, based on what Elias had taught her when she was 11. She had also, on an impulse she did not entirely examine, placed 2 of Elias's composition notebooks on the cabin table for the students to look at, not to read in full, but to see, to understand that this data had been collected by a person, one specific person, who had cared enough to come out here year after year and write things down. The students were 12 and 13 years old and had the attention spans appropriate to that age, which was variable, but the creek got them. It always got people. She was learning. There was something about moving water, about the specific intelligence of it finding its way over and around and through whatever was in front of it, that produced in almost everyone a version of the stillness it had produced in Elias for 30 years. One student, a boy named Dominic, who had been the most restless in the car and the first to put his phone away when he reached the bank, crouched at the water's edge for 40 minutes. He was watching the gravel bottom of the shallow section, where the current sorted particles by weight and size, and deposited them in patterns that were, if you knew how to look, a map of everything the water had been through upstream. "Why does it do that?" he asked Dana, pointing at the pattern. She told him about particle size and current speed and the relationship between the two, about how you could read the history of a watershed in the gravel on its floor, about how Elias had taught her this when she was not much younger than Dominic was now. Dominic looked at the gravel for another long moment. "That's kind of like reading," he said. "Like the creek is writing something." Dana looked at the water and thought about 40 years of composition notebooks. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it is." Mr. Adler asked, at the end of the visit, whether she would consider doing it again. Maybe a spring session and a fall session, so the students could see the creek in different conditions. He said it with the careful tone of someone who understood they were asking for something that required her time and her land and her effort, and who was trying not to presume. She said yes before he finished the sentence. The second visit happened in May. By the third visit, in October, Teresa, the parent volunteer, had connected Dana with a regional land trust organization that was developing an educational partnership program for privately held conservation properties. They offered a small grant for curriculum development, which Dana used to hire a retired biology teacher named Helen, who had spent 30 years teaching ecology in the county and who knew the watershed the way Elias had known his creek, which was intimately and specifically and without sentimentality. Helen came out to the cabin and walked the property with Dana and asked sharp questions about the mineral extraction operation on the eastern section, specifically about the monitoring data and the buffer zone between the extraction area and the creek corridor. Dana showed her the agreement and the quarterly monitoring reports, which were running clean. Helen read them with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what to look for and where operators were tempted to cut corners. "This is tighter than most," she said, handing the reports back. "You negotiated well. My grandfather negotiated the first 37 years. I just did the last 6 months." Helen looked out at the creek. He understood what he had. Yes. Most people don't. They see land, and they think acreage and assessed value. They don't think about what's living in it. She paused. "That's what we teach. Or try to." They sat on the porch in the October light and talked for 2 hours about what a real educational program might look like, using the cabin and the creek and the 40 years of Elias's data as the foundation. Helen had specific ideas and Dana had specific resources, and Teresa's land trust connection had specific funding mechanisms, and by the time Helen left that afternoon, they had the outline of something that was not yet a program, but had stopped being just an idea. Dana wrote it in her notebook under what comes next. She had been adding to that list for months and crossing things off as they happened. The college account was funded and growing. The farmhouse rental had become, in January, a purchase because Frank the landlord had decided he was tired of being a landlord and had offered it to Dana first before listing it, at a price that was fair for both of them and that Dana's accountant confirmed she could handle without compromising anything else on the list. She owned a farmhouse with drafty windows and a woodlet behind the yard and a kitchen where the light came in from the east every morning. She owned 7 acres on Grayling Creek with a cabin that had a solid roof and a working bathroom and 26 composition notebooks on the shelf above the bunk. She had a position at a dental practice with a partnership track that was running ahead of the original schedule because, as her supervising partner had told her in her 6-month review, she was the kind of person who did not need to be told something twice. She had Maya, who was now 11 and had developed an opinion about creek hydrology that she was willing to defend at length, which Dana took as a sign that something Elias had started when Dana was 11 years old was continuing in the right direction. She had the quarterly royalty payments, which arrived on schedule and were, by the second year of operation, running at the higher end of Kimura's projected range. The monitoring reports were clean. The creek was clean. The great blue heron still worked the far bank on mornings when the water was low enough. She crossed things off the list. She added new things. The list kept going, which was its own kind of answer to a question she had been asking for a long time. By the second spring, the educational program at the cabin had a name. The Greer Creek Watershed Project, which was Helen's suggestion, insisted on by Dana only because it put Elias's name on something that would outlast both of them. They ran 4 sessions a year, 2 with Mr. Adler's class and 2 with schools from the next county over that the land trust had recruited. Helen led the science curriculum. Dana talked about the history of the land, The 40 years of notebooks, what it meant to protect something over a long period of time, and why the decisions you made about land were decisions that echoed beyond your own lifetime. She had not expected to be good at the talking part. She had spent most of her adult life in a profession that required precision and quiet, and a specific kind of attention to other people's discomfort. She had not thought of herself as someone with a story worth telling. But standing on the bank of Grayling Creek with 23 seventh graders arranged in a loose arc around her, she found that the story told itself. Elias buying 7 acres in 1962 because he had fallen in love with a creek. The composition notebooks. The man in the truck with the company logo, saying, "Your land has value." And Elias, for 37 years, saying, "I know." The students understood this. They were 12 and 13, which was old enough to understand that things got taken when you were not paying attention, and young enough to still believe that paying attention was something you could choose to do. She always ended with the same thing. She took out Elias's last notebook and read them the final entry. The one about the great blue heron, watched for 20 minutes before it lifted off and moved upstream. And then the single sentence below it, the one that did not quite match the rest. "I hope she knows she was always my favorite." She never explained who she was. She did not need to. The students were old enough to understand that some things were said too late, and that too late was still better than not at all. She folded the notebook carefully and put it back in her bag and looked at the creek, and the students looked at the creek, and for a moment the only sound was the water moving over the gravel in the shallow section where Dominic had crouched and watched the particles sort themselves by weight. Then someone always asked a question, and the moment passed, and they got back to the business of learning, which was its own kind of continuation. The program grew in ways Dana had not fully anticipated. Which she was learning was the nature of things you did not try to control too precisely. By the second fall, word had reached a community college 40 minutes away whose environmental studies program was looking for field sites. Their coordinator, a woman named Patricia who drove a truck with 2 kayaks strapped to the roof and had the kind of organized energy that produced results without requiring drama, contacted Dana through the land trust and asked whether the cabin could host an upper division watershed ecology seminar for sessions across the fall semester with 12 college students who would conduct actual sampling and analysis and compare their results to Elias's composition notebook data. Dana said yes. She had been saying yes with increasing ease since that first call to Mr. Adler's classroom, and she was aware that this was itself a change in her, a recalibration away from the defensive caution that had developed through 9 years of managing someone else's certainty. Yes was the direction the current was going, and she had learned to read the current. The college students were different from the 7th graders and the 4th graders. They arrived with their own equipment and their own frameworks and opinions about methodology that occasionally required Helen to perform what Dana privately called diplomatic corrections, which Helen executed with the precision of a retired teacher who had long ago learned to be right without making people feel wrong. What they brought that the younger students could not was the ability to put Elias's notebooks into genuine scientific context. One of them, a young woman named Sophie who was completing a double major in ecology and data science, asked Dana if she could digitize the composition notebook data as part of her course project. She wanted to run the 40 years of temperature and clarity and biological indicator readings through a statistical model to see what patterns emerged over time. Dana said yes, carefully, with the condition that the original stayed at the cabin. Sophie produced a 50-page analysis at the end of the semester that showed, among other things, a measurable correlation between the water clarity readings in Elias's notebooks and rainfall patterns going back to regional weather records from the same period. The creek had been functioning as a recorder of the local climate for 40 years, and Elias had been its instrument without knowing that was what he was. Dana read the analysis at the kitchen table in the farmhouse on a December evening and thought about a retired machinist writing his daily observations in a composition notebook because it was the right thing to do with things you noticed, because you owed it to the world to pay attention and to write down what you saw. He had been doing science. He simply had not known to call it that. She emailed Sophie and told her so. Sophie wrote back, "That's the best thing anyone has ever said to me about a project. Thank you." Dana printed the analysis and put it in the Outbuilding with the original notebooks, in the same foam-padded space where the coin collection had lived before she moved it to the climate-controlled vault. It seemed like the right place for something that completed what Elias had been building without knowing he was building it. The conversation with Jess happened in April of the second year, on a Saturday afternoon at the farmhouse, with both their daughters somewhere in the woodlot behind the yard doing something that involved a complicated system of sticks and required no adult supervision. They were at the kitchen table with coffee and the particular ease of a friendship that had survived enough difficulty to know its own weight. Jess said, "Have you thought about what happens when the extraction operation ends?" Dana looked at her coffee. Kimura says 10 to 12 years from the start date. We're 2 years in. So 8 to 10 years. Give or take. And then the eastern section goes back to native vegetation and the remediation is complete and the land is whole again. That's the agreement. Jess turned her cup in her hands. I'm asking because I want to know what you want. Not what the agreement says. What you actually want. Dana had thought about this. She had thought about it in the way she thought about things that were still some distance away, not with specific plans, but with a general orientation, the way you know you are heading towards something without yet being able to see its shape. I want the land to be what my grandfather wanted it to be, she said. A place that stays the way it is. A place someone comes to learn something. The program, and maybe something bigger. I've been talking to Teresa about what it would take to put a conservation easement on the eastern section too, after remediation, to protect the whole 7 acres the same way the creek corridor is protected. Can you do that? Kimura says yes. The royalty income gives me the financial position to do it without needing to sell anything or negotiate anything. I just decide and file the paperwork. Jess was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather would have liked that. I think so. He protected it the only way he could, which was by saying no. You get to protect it a different way. Dana looked out the kitchen window at the woodlot, where she could hear Maya and Kara arguing companionably about the stick system. He gave me the resources to do what he couldn't. That's the whole thing. That's what the collection was for, and the deposit was for, and the notebooks were for. He was building something he wouldn't live to finish. Jess set down her cup. And you're finishing it. I'm finishing it. They sat with that for a moment, in the comfortable way of people who do not need to make more of something than it already is. Outside, Maya's voice rose above the woodlit noise in what sounded like a definitive pronouncement about stick placement. Kara's response was audible, but not intelligible. Then both of them laughed, and the argument was apparently resolved, and the sounds of construction resumed. Dana looked at her friend across the table. I went back and read every one of the notebooks, she said. All 26. Over the winter. A few at a time. I'd go out to the cabin on a Saturday and read through a year or two, and then sit on the porch and watch the water. What did you find? She had thought about how to answer this question, if anyone ever asked it. I found a person I should have known better. Someone who understood things I spent years not understanding. About patience. About the difference between what something is worth and what someone will offer you for it. She paused. And about the fact that the most important things you do are usually not the things that look important at the time. Jess waited. He didn't think he was doing anything remarkable. He was just saying no to people with trucks and business cards. He was just writing things down in composition notebooks. He was just sitting on a porch and watching a creek. She looked at her coffee. But he was building something. He just didn't know for certain that anyone would come along to receive it. You came along. I almost didn't. If I had sold it that first fall, the way Patrice recommended, for $45,000. If I hadn't found the notebooks. If I hadn't called the geology department. She shook her head. There were so many places where it could have gone differently. But it didn't. It didn't. Jess smiled, slowly, the way she smiled at things that had earned it. I think he knew you'd figure it out. I think that's why he wrote the letter. Dana looked at the woodlet. Through the trees she could see Maya, moving purposefully between 2 spruce saplings with a long stick held at a precise angle, entirely absorbed in whatever project was underway. He wrote in one of the early notebooks, she said, something about fishing, about how the best fishermen are not the ones who catch the most. They're the ones who understand the water well enough to know where to wait. Jess said nothing. She knew when Dana was getting to something. I think that's what he did with this property. He understood it well enough to know what to wait for. And he waited. She paused. And I think that's what I'm doing now. Not waiting exactly, but building something that requires patience. The program, the easement, the notebooks as actual data for actual science. Things that take time to become what they're trying to be. That's a good life, Jess said quietly. Yes, Dana said. It is. The third year of the extraction operation brought the largest royalty payments yet, as the operation reached its full production rate. Dana handled each payment with the same order she had established from the beginning. The college account first. The conservation fund contribution. Ellen's quarterly review. The program's operating costs, which had grown as the land trust partnership expanded and now included a small stipend for Helen and materials for student visits. The rest went into an investment account that Ellen managed with a conservative approach Dana had specifically requested because she was not interested in aggressive returns that required aggressive risk. She was interested in something that would be there when she needed it, which was a different orientation than the one that produced spectacular gains and spectacular losses, and which suited the person she was becoming. She was 39 years old, and she was becoming the person she had probably always been underneath the 9 years of managing someone else's certainty about who she was. That was the thing about the marriage she had needed distance to understand. It had not been violent or dramatic. It had been gradual, the slow accumulation of someone else's definition of what mattered and what did not, until she had organized herself almost entirely around those definitions without quite noticing it was happening. The divorce had not been liberation in the way movies suggested liberation was, sudden and decisive and accompanied by some version of a triumphant moment. It had been more like coming out of a fog that you had not known was fog while you were in it, and finding that your sense of direction had been slightly off for a long time, and needing to recalibrate, and the recalibration taking longer than you expected. The cabin had been part of the recalibration. The notebooks, the creek, the quiet that was not lonely but something else, the particular quality of being alone in a place that had been cared for by someone who understood solitude as a chosen condition rather than an imposed one. She had become, over 3 years, someone who spent 2 mornings a week on a porch above a creek in whatever weather the season produced. Not meditating, not journaling, not doing anything deliberate. Just sitting with the sound of the water and the light through the birches and the occasional kingfisher or heron moving through the frame and then out of it. Elias had done this for 24 years. She understood now why. The 4th grade class from Millbrook Elementary came to the cabin in May of the 3rd year as part of an expanded partnership the Land Trust had arranged with 3 new schools. They were younger than the students Dana was used to hosting, which required a different approach, simpler language and more direct sensory engagement, and a shorter attention span for the talking portions. She had adapted. Helen had helped her adapt. They stood on the creek bank, 22 9-year-olds in rain boots arranged in the specific chaos that 9-year-olds arrange themselves in when they are very interested in something and not yet sure of the rules. Dana pointed to the far bank where the heron had worked the morning before. There was a bird standing there yesterday, she said. Right on that spot. Do you know what kind of bird stands completely still in shallow water for 20 minutes without moving? A girl in the front raised her hand. A heron. A great blue heron. Yes. How did you know? We have one at my grandma's pond. Then you know how still they can be. The girl nodded seriously. Grandma says they're patient. They are. They're waiting for fish. They don't chase the fish. They stand very still, and they wait for the fish to come to them. Dana paused, looking at the far bank. My grandfather watched this same creek for 30 years. He used to say the best fishing spots are the ones nobody else thinks to look at. But you have to know how to be still enough to see them. The 9-year-olds looked at the far bank. 22 of them, quiet for perhaps 15 seconds, which was remarkable. Then a boy near the back said, Did your grandpa catch a lot of fish? He released everything he caught. The boy processed this. Then why did he fish? Dana smiled. He liked to see what was there. The boy thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to looking at the creek bank. She looked at the water moving over the gravel and thought about Elias in 1962, 30 years old, buying 7 acres because he had fallen in love with a particular stretch of water. About all the mornings he had stood on this bank and watched. About the great blue heron in the last notebook entry, watched for 20 minutes and then released, the same way he released the fish. He liked to see what was there. That was it. That was the whole thing. Not to own it, not to exploit it, not to extract the value and move on. Just to see what was there, to understand it well enough to protect it, to pass on that understanding to someone who would do the same. She was doing the same. The program ran 4 sessions that spring, more than it had ever run before, with 3 different schools and 61 students total, and Dana drove out to the cabin for every single one of them, and stood on that bank, and talked about water and patience, and a retired machinist who had spent 30 years writing things down in composition notebooks, because he believed that paying attention was its own kind of work. One of the sessions fell on the anniversary of the day she had found the outbuilding. She had not planned this. She realized it that morning when she looked at the date on her phone, standing in the farmhouse kitchen drinking coffee, and felt the recognition of it settle over her like weather. 3 years since she had stood on a concrete floor with 3 foam-padded boxes in her lap, and a letter from her grandfather in her hands, and no idea yet of the shape of what she had found. She drove out to the cabin early, before the students arrived. She sat on the porch in the May morning with coffee and Elias's last notebook and read the final entry one more time. The great blue heron. Watched for 20 minutes. Moved upstream. I hope she knows she was always my favorite. She closed the notebook and looked at the creek. The water was high with May snow melt, running faster and darker than it would in summer, pushing through the bend below the cabin with the particular urgency of cold water in a warm month. Impatient in the way that spring water is always impatient, moving through towards something it could not yet see. She sat with it for a while. Then she heard the sound of a car on the gravel road and went to meet the students. The conversation she had been avoiding with Brandon happened in July of the 3rd year, not because she sought it out, but because Maya did. Maya was 11, going on 12, and had arrived at the age where she had opinions about things she had previously accepted as given. She had opinions about her school schedule and her friendships and the specific injustice of certain homework assignments, and, increasingly, about the divorce and what it had meant and what it continued to mean. She brought it up one evening at the farmhouse kitchen table after dinner, while Dana was washing dishes and Maya was supposed to be doing homework, but had clearly been sitting with something instead. "Dad called today," she said. Dana turned off the water. "I know. He texted me. He said he heard about the cabin program. The school thing." Dana dried her hands and sat down across from her daughter. "What did he say about it?" "He said it was impressive." Maya's expression was careful, the way it was when she was trying to be fair to 2 people at once. "He sounded surprised." "Okay. Are you mad that he said that?" Dana thought about this. About the specific quality of Brandon's surprise, which she could imagine precisely from 3 years of knowing exactly how he organized his assumptions. He had assessed her in February, and his assessment had been wrong, and this was apparently still reaching him in pieces, through things like a watershed education program at a cabin on a creek that he had never thought to look at. "No," she said. "I'm not mad." Maya looked at her steadily. "Do you think he's sorry?" "I think he's surprised. Those aren't always the same thing." Maya nodded slowly. "I told him he should come see the cabin sometime." Dana went very still. "Not to cause trouble," Maya said quickly. He doesn't know what it's like out there. He doesn't know about great-grandpa Elias, or the notebooks, or the heron. He doesn't know that part of things." She looked at the table. "I'm not trying to make things weird." Dana looked at her daughter, who was 11 years old and trying to hold 2 households inside herself with the fairness of someone who understood that the people she loved were not required to be right about each other. "You didn't make things weird," Dana said. "You're allowed to want your dad to know things about your life. Do you mind if he comes sometime?" Dana thought about the cabin, which was hers in every sense that mattered. The repaired porch, the solid roof, the notebooks on the shelf, the creek below. She thought about Elias saying no for 37 years, and about how saying no, as a permanent posture, could become its own kind of cage. "If he wants to come, he can come," she said. "But he comes as your dad visiting the program, not as anything else." Maya's face settled into relief that she had been clearly working to conceal. "Okay. And he calls ahead." "Obviously. And he wears appropriate shoes for the bank. The mud is serious." Maya almost smiled. "I'll tell him about the shoes." He came in September, on a Saturday when the program was running a session with Mr. Adler's new 8th grade class, which meant there were 17 students on the bank and Helen leading the water chemistry component and Dana explaining the monitoring data from the quarterly Meridian reports. The monitoring had been clean for 3 consecutive years. The creek chemistry showed no change from Elias's baseline readings in the 1990s. The independent overseer had filed 3 reports, and all 3 had come back with the same word in the summary section: compliant. Dana had read each one at the kitchen table and then filed it in the outbuilding with Sophie's analysis and the original notebooks, building a record that was its own kind of insurance against the future. Brandon arrived with Maya, who had driven with him from the city, and stood at the edge of the group with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of a man who has come to a place that is nothing like what he expected. Dana did not stop the session. She finished the explanation about the monitoring data, answered 2 student questions, and then handed the group back to Helen for the next component. Then she walked over to where Brandon stood. He looked different from the last time she had seen him, which was the parking lot outside the courthouse, 3 years and 2 months ago. He was thinner in a way that looked like stress rather than intention, and he was standing with a slight uncertainty that she did not recognize from the version of him she had been married to. "This is not what I pictured," he said. "What did you picture?" "I don't know. Something smaller." She looked out at the students on the bank, at Helen crouching at the water's edge with a test kit, at Maya standing between 2 of the 8th graders with the proprietary ease of someone on their home ground. It started smaller. He was quiet for a moment. On the creek bank, Dominic, who was now in 8th grade and who had become something of a regular presence at the sessions in ways that Mr. Adler had encouraged, was pointing at something in the water and explaining it to the student beside him. "Maya talks about this place constantly," Brandon said. "I know. She talks about your grandfather. About the notebooks." He paused. "She talks about you." Dana said nothing. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out careful and deliberate, the way words come when they have been considered for a long time and the person saying them has finally decided they need to be said. "About a lot of things. About what you were capable of. About what you would do." He looked at the creek. "I told you that you would get nothing. I was very sure of that." She waited. "I'm sorry," he said, "that I said it the way I did. That I was that sure." She had imagined this conversation in various forms over 3 years, and in most of those imagined versions, she had said things that were true and sharp and would have felt good to say. In this actual version, standing on the edge of a creek bank while 17 8th graders learned to read water chemistry, she found that none of those things seemed necessary. "You weren't wrong about the numbers," she said. "At the time, the numbers were what they were. But the property was always mine." "Yes." She looked at him levelly. "But you couldn't have known that." "I didn't know that." He looked at her. "You made this. My grandfather made this. I just showed up." "Dana." He said her name the way he used to say it when he was actually trying to reach her, which had happened less and less toward the end. "You figured out a 40-year mystery and negotiated a mineral rights agreement and rebuilt a cabin and started an education program. You didn't just show up." She looked at the water. She thought about all the ways she had been told, over 9 years, what she was and was not capable of. The slow accumulation of it. The way it had eventually come to feel like fact rather than opinion. "Thank you for saying that," she said, and meant it, without complication, which surprised her. They stood for a moment in something that was not comfortable and was not uncomfortable, but was simply what it was, which was 2 people who had hurt each other and built separate lives, and were standing on a creek bank watching their daughter explain something to an 8th grader with the authority of someone who knew what she was talking about. "She's remarkable," Brandon said. "Yes," Dana said. "She is." He stayed for 2 hours. He watched the session. He asked Helen 2 questions about the water chemistry testing that were genuine questions, not performance, and Helen answered them with the directness she applied to everyone. He walked the bank with Maya, who showed him the gravel patterns in the shallow section and explained what they indicated about the upstream conditions, using the same language Dana had used with Dominic 2 years ago, because Maya had been listening that day and had apparently kept it. When he left, he shook Dana's hand at the edge of the property, which was formal and a little awkward and was exactly the right register for what they were to each other now. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. "Maya wanted you to see it." "I know, but you could have said no." She looked at the property. The cabin with its new roof visible through the birches. The creek audible below. The students still on the bank. The session winding down. Helen packing up her testing kit. "Some things," she said, "are worth letting people see." He nodded. Then he got in his car and drove down the gravel road and out of sight. She stood at the edge of the property for a moment, alone, in the particular silence that follows when people leave a place they were not sure how to arrive at. The September afternoon had the quality of light that came at the turn of the season, not yet autumn, but no longer summer. The birches holding their green a little too deliberately, the creek running at its lowest of the year, slow and clear and very cold. She could see the gravel bottom in the shallow section, the particles sorted by weight and current, the map of everything the water had been through upstream laid out in the sediment for anyone who knew how to read it. Then Maya was beside her, having come up the bank in the quiet way she had developed, which was her grandmother's way and probably Elias's way before that, the particular economy of movement of a person who had learned to exist in spaces they loved without disturbing them. That was okay? Maya asked. That was okay. He cried a little. In the car on the way here. He thought I didn't notice. Dana looked at her daughter. Did you say anything? No. I just let him. Maya shrugged, with the equanimity of someone who had learned that some emotions needed to be witnessed rather than managed. He needed to see it. He did. Maya looked out at the creek, where the last two students were still at the bank with Dominic, arguing about something that probably mattered a great deal in the context of water chemistry and not at all in any other context. Great-Grandpa Elias would have been good at this, she said. The program. Teaching kids about the creek. Dana thought about a man who had explained the current to her when she was 11 years old, on this same bank, in his spare and economical way. He had been good at teaching. He had simply not had many students. He would have, she said. Maybe that's why he gave it to you. Because you would make it into something he couldn't. Dana looked at her daughter, who was 11 years old and had arrived at the same understanding Dana had taken 3 years to reach. Maybe, she said. They walked back to the cabin together through the birches, the creek sound following them up the bank, steady and continuous, the way it had followed Elias for 30 years and would follow whoever came after, carrying the same water it had always carried, shaped by the same rock and grade and season, reading the same path of least resistance through land that someone had decided, for decades ago, was worth more than any number written on a piece of paper. The students loaded into the cars. Helen packed her kit. The September light came low and golden through the birches, the particular light of a season that is not yet over, but is beginning its ending. Dana sat on the porch when everyone had gone. She sat in the chair on the left, which had been her chair for 3 years now, while the right one had been Maya's. She sat with her coffee and her grandfather's last notebook and the sound of the creek below her and the late afternoon moving through its natural diminishment toward evening. She did not open the notebook. She knew it by heart. She sat and looked at the water. The great blue heron was on the far bank. She had not seen it approach. It was simply there, the way it was sometimes simply there, occupying its particular spot in the shallow section with the absolute stillness of a creature that understood patience as something other than waiting. She watched it. It worked the bank with slow, precise movements. It knew exactly where to stand. It knew how to read the water, which fish were where, which current would bring something toward it, and which would carry something away. It had learned this over years, over many visits to this same stretch of water, until the knowledge was not something it consulted, but something it simply was. Dana sat very still and watched. For minutes. 5. The heron stood without moving, its attention entire and without reservation, a creature at the exact intersection of what it was and what it was doing, nothing extraneous, nothing wasted. Then it struck. Fast and certain and without hesitation, the long bill cutting into the water and coming back up. It had caught something. It tilted its head back to swallow, the motion brief and efficient, and then returned to its posture, still and watchful, already looking for the next thing. Dana let out a slow breath. She thought about a 9-year-old girl in a brown paper bag moment, standing in a parking lot with a key on a metal ring and no idea what it opened. She thought about $45,000 and a real estate agent with the expression of someone delivering news a person cannot afford. She thought about Paul from the geology department, and Dorothea in the county records office, and Wallace Kimura's orderly office with the fly fishing photographs on the walls. She thought about a sealed outbuilding and 3 foam-padded boxes and a letter that began with an apology. She thought about a man who had said no, and no, and no again, for 37 years, keeping his notebooks and releasing his fish and watching his creek and trusting that the right person would eventually come back and stand on this bank and understand what they had. She had understood what she had. She had built something with it. She was still building. The heron spread its enormous wings and lifted off the water, unhurried, beating slowly up the creek and around the bend and out of sight. Dana sat on the porch a little longer, in the evening light, with the creek running below her and the birches holding the last of the gold, and felt the specific peace of a person who has arrived somewhere real after a very long route. Then she went inside and called Maya in for dinner. And somewhere below the cabin, moving through the last of the September light, the creek kept going, the way it always had, the way it would long after anyone living could remember who had sat above it and decided it was worth protecting, carrying the same cold water it had always carried, reading the rock and the grade and the season, patient and continuous and entirely itself. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.